Here's a question for you. What do you think about your coworkers? What about your peers? What about your boss? Are they your friends? Do you like them? Do you get along with them well? Or are they more of a frustration to you? That's an important question in our jobs, isn't it? Because no matter what our job is, we're always surrounded by people. And it's important how we treat those people and how we get along with them. As Christians, we understand that seeing our jobs in the light of the gospel affects our relationships with the people around us. See, if you think of your job as an idol, if it's the main thing that you're pursuing in your life, if it's the main center of your worship, then you'll see the people around you as just obstacles to your own pursuit of success. Maybe you'll see your coworkers as people who want the same job that you want, the same promotion that you want. Maybe you'll even look at your boss and say, I want her job. Or you'll look at your employees as people who are just not working hard enough to make you look good. On the other hand, if you're idle in your work, if you're missing out on seeing God's purposes for you in the job, then you'll see your coworkers and your boss, maybe even your employees, as just kind of sounding boards for your complaints, rather than as people who are made in the image of God and who God intends for you to love, just as you love yourself. So how should we, if our lives are driven by the gospel, if we see our jobs in light of the gospel, how should we treat the people around us? How should we treat our coworkers? How should we treat our bosses? How should we treat those whom we employ ourselves? Let me give you some advice on how maybe this idea of seeing your job in the light of the gospel should play out in your relationships with other people. For one thing, we as gospel workers ought to be happy to submit to authority. Authority is something that has a bad rap in our society. It's not something we like to think about, and it's certainly not something that we like to submit to. And yet, if we understand ourselves as workers for the King, then we understand ourselves also as people who should submit happily to authority, not bucket when it is good for us. Another way that the gospel affects our relationships with other people is that it ought to make us people who are not marked by complaint. I'm sure you'd agree with me that in most workplaces, complaints are just sort of the coin of the realm. It's the way we talk to one another. We talk about how we don't like the work circumstances, or we don't like the boss, or we don't like the new policy. What would it be like if you were a person, because of the power of the gospel in your life, who was simply not marked by complaint? What if you were the kind of person who just did happily what the job required of you, even if you didn't think it was all that productive, but you did it simply because you're submitting happily to authority? My guess is that would adorn the gospel that you preach. Another way the gospel affects our relationships with our coworkers is that it can create in us a sense of godly competitiveness. Now that might surprise you, because a lot of people would look at the Christian life and say, well listen, that sort of ethic and that sort of life, doesn't it cut out any sense of competitiveness at all? I don't think so. I think it actually creates a sense of competitiveness in us that is not so much cutthroat as it is godly. So when you're pursuing a promotion, or when you're pursuing another job and there are other people who are competing with you for that job, what a Christian will do is not trip everyone around them in the race. They'll simply outrun the people who they're competing. They're not trying to beat down the other people by stopping them from doing well. In fact, they're doing so well themselves that they're encouraging the ones around them to compete and to work hard themselves. So the gospel creates a sense of godly competitiveness in us. What about your relationship with your employees? Maybe you are the boss and you're the one who employs other people. How does the gospel affect the way you interact with your employees? Well, it teaches us as bosses to use authority in a godly way. It teaches us to understand authority correctly. So, for example, we need to remember as Christian bosses that authority comes from God. The authority that we have over our employees is not an authority that just comes from the company, and it's certainly not an authority that just comes from our own selves. No, if we have authority, it's because God has given that authority to us, and we're supposed to use that authority for the good of people around us. In that sense, we imitate Jesus, don't we, with our authority. Jesus had enormous authority. He said that he could have called 12 legions of angels down to rescue him from the cross, and yet he didn't do it. Always throughout his life, Jesus used the authority that he had for the good of the people around him, not to their detriment. And we as Christian bosses ought to imitate him in that and use our authority for good as well. In short, our use of authority over our employees ought to be gospel motivated and grace empowered. Not one of us is going to be able to use authority rightly by our own power. It's only going to be when we understand how God himself uses his authority, and when he gives us, by his grace, the power to use authority in the same way so that others around us might be blessed. That's how we ought to use our authority as Christian bosses. As you go through this session, think about some practical ways that the gospel affects your relationships with people you work with. How does the gospel affect the way you interact with coworkers? How does it affect the way you interact with your employees? How does it affect the way you interact with your boss? Think about the way the gospel encourages you to care about those people, not just as fellow cogs in a machine, but as people who are created in the image of God and who need to know Jesus themselves. How does the gospel affect your relationships at work? That's the question we're going to talk about today.